The cold wind carried the scent of rain as Lillian Keller's stagecoach rattled to a stop outside Marysville, Montana territory. 1878. Clutching her black morning gloves tightly in one hand, she stared through the dust-coated window at the small frontier town that held nothing for her but the promise of anonymity, exactly what she needed after burying both her husband and infant son back in Philadelphia. "Last stop, madam," the driver called, his voice rough from years of shouting over thundering hooves and creaking wheels. "Marysville. End of the line." Lillian nodded, though no one could see the gesture. End of the line indeed. At 26, she felt as though her life had reached its conclusion alongside Thomas and little James. Her husband's business partner had swindled her out of their home and savings before her husband's body was even cold, leaving her with nothing but 2 trunks of clothing, a handful of jewelry, and grief so heavy it felt like stones sewn into the fabric of her black dress. The stagecoach door swung open. A weathered hand appeared, offering assistance. Lillian took it automatically and stepped down into ankle-deep mud. Spring in Montana was evidently a soggy affair. "First time in Marysville?" asked the station manager, a portly man with a gray-flecked beard. "Yes." Lillian's voice sounded foreign to her own ears. She'd barely spoken in weeks. "Got people waiting for you?" She shook her head. "No. I was hoping to find accommodations and perhaps employment." The station manager's expression softened with something like pity. Lillian hated it immediately. She'd seen enough pitying glances at the funeral to last several lifetimes. "Morrison's boarding house is 2 streets that way," he said, pointing. "Tell Widow Morrison that Hank sent you. She might know of work." Lillian thanked him, paid a boy to carry her trunks, and began trudging through the mud toward what she hoped would be temporary lodging. The boarding house was a 2-story clapboard structure that had once been white, but had weathered to a grayish shade that matched Lillian's spirits. Widow Morrison proved to be a sharp-eyed woman of about 60 with surprisingly delicate hands for someone who ran a boarding house alone. She looked Lillian up and down, taking in her quality morning dress and city boots now ruined with mud. "Another widow," she said flatly. "The West collects us like wildflowers. What skills do you have, Mrs. Keller?" "Lillian Keller." She straightened her spine. "I was a schoolteacher before my marriage, and I can sew, cook, and keep books." Widow Morrison nodded approvingly. "The town's schoolteacher left for Denver last month. The council's been searching for a replacement. In the meantime, you can help me with the mending. I've more than I can handle with 8 boarders." Within days, Lillian found herself appointed as the new schoolteacher of Marysville. The position came with a small salary and a room at the schoolhouse that would be available in 2 weeks when the caretaker finished repairs. It wasn't much, but it was a start, something to focus on besides the hollow ache in her chest where her heart used to be. For 2 weeks, she helped Widow Morrison with the boarding house while preparing lessons for her future pupils. In the evenings, she sat alone in her rented room, sewing black ribbons onto her few colored dresses to make them suitable for a widow. Sometimes she would touch the small portrait of Thomas and James she kept in her locket, but she never opened it. The pain was still too fresh. On the Sunday before she was to begin teaching, Lillian decided to attend the small church on the edge of town. Not out of any particular religious fervor, her faith had been severely tested by recent events, but because in a town this size, it would be expected of the schoolteacher. The service was simple but heartfelt. Afterward, as people mingled outside, Lillian stood apart, acknowledging introductions with polite nods but offering little conversation. She was about to leave when a commotion drew everyone's attention to the road. A wagon was approaching at a dangerous speed. The driver slumped over. The horses, panicked without guidance, were heading straight toward a group of children playing near the church steps. Before anyone else could react, a tall man in dusty clothes sprinted from the gathering, positioned himself in the path of the horses, and with remarkable calm, caught hold of their bridles. The animals reared and fought, but the man stood firm, speaking low, soothing words until they settled. Only then did others rush forward to help the unconscious driver. "That's Preston James for you," Widow Morrison said beside Lillian. "Fastest reflexes in the territory. Owns the Double J Ranch about 5 miles out. Good man, if a bit solitary since his brother died." Lillian watched as Preston James helped carry the driver apparently suffering from heat stroke into the shade. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to taking charge in emergencies. His face was partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or so. "He lost his brother just last year," Widow Morrison continued. "Benjamin was the sociable one. Preston's always been quieter, more focused on the ranch. Works harder than 3 men combined." Lillian felt a flicker of unwanted kinship with this stranger. She knew what it was to lose family, to have grief become an unwelcome companion. The following morning, Lillian woke before dawn to prepare for her first day of teaching. The schoolhouse was a simple one-room building with rows of benches, a pot-bellied stove, and a small attached living space in the back. True to Widow Morrison's word, it had been freshly repaired, with new glass in the windows and a sturdy new door. To her surprise, 22 students of varying ages appeared for lessons. The youngest was barely 5, the oldest a gangly boy of 16 who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Lillian introduced herself, established rules, and began assessing their knowledge levels. By midday, she had separated them into 4 groups based on ability rather than age. By the final bell, she had their respect, if not their affection. It was a start. Days stretched into weeks as Lillian established a routine. She threw herself into teaching, finding that exhaustion was preferable to lying awake thinking of what she had lost. The children began to warm to her, bringing her wildflowers and occasionally apples from family orchards. One afternoon in late May, as Lillian was dismissing her students, she noticed a rider approaching the schoolhouse. The children scattered with cheerful goodbyes, leaving her alone to face the visitor. As he dismounted, she recognized Preston James, though she hadn't seen him since that Sunday at church. Up close, he was more imposing, tall and broad-shouldered, with features weathered by sun and wind. His eyes, a startling blue beneath dark brows, regarded her with cautious interest. "Mrs. Keller," he said, removing his hat. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Mr. James. School has just finished for the day." Lillian gestured toward the building. "Would you like to come in for tea?" He seemed surprised by the invitation but nodded. "Thank you, madam." Inside, Lillian busied herself with the kettle and teapot while Preston James looked around the schoolroom with interest. "You've organized things differently," he observed. "When old Mr. Grayson was teaching, the children just sat by age." "I find ability grouping more effective," Lillian said, placing cups on her small table. "A child of 8 who reads well shouldn't be held back by age alone, nor should a 14-year-old who struggles be embarrassed by being placed with younger children." Preston nodded thoughtfully. "Makes sense." He accepted the tea she offered. "I've actually come with a proposition, Mrs. Keller." Lillian raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I understand you've taken on extra sewing to supplement your teacher's salary." She stiffened slightly. She had indeed been taking in mending and alteration work in the evenings. The teacher's salary was barely enough for necessities. "I have a situation at my ranch," he continued. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy has gone east to care for her daughter through a difficult pregnancy. She'll be gone at least until autumn." "I see," Lillian said, though she didn't yet. "I need someone to cook and keep house at the ranch during the summer break. The pay would be considerably more than what you're earning now." He paused. "And there's plenty of room. The ranch house is large." Lillian considered the offer. Summer break was starting in just 2 weeks. She had been wondering how she would manage without her teaching salary for those months. "I couldn't live at your ranch, Mr. James. It would be improper." "Mrs. Abernathy's quarters are separate from the main house," he said quickly. "And I have 3 ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse. Your reputation would be safe." Something in his earnest expression made Lillian think there was more to his offer than just needing household help. "Why me?" she asked directly. "Surely there are others in town more experienced in ranch work." Preston set down his teacup carefully. "Honestly, Mrs. Keller, I've heard good things about you from the children. My foreman's son, Timothy, says you're fair and kind, and—" he hesitated. "Widow Morrison mentioned your circumstances. I know what it's like to start over after loss. Sometimes a change of scenery helps." Lillian felt a mixture of irritation at being the subject of town gossip and unexpected gratitude for this man's straightforward understanding. "I'll consider it," she said finally, "but I would need to return to town occasionally to check on my room here and attend church. Of course, I come into town for supplies weekly. You could ride along." He stood, placing his hat back on. "Think about it. The offer stands until school ends." After he left, Lillian sat for a long time at her table. The ranch job would mean better pay and a change of surroundings. Perhaps being away from town, where everyone knew her as the widow teacher, would provide some respite from the constant reminders of her status. By the time school ended for summer, Lillian had made her decision. She packed her trunks once more, arranged for her schoolroom to be maintained in her absence, and climbed into Preston James's wagon for the 5-mile journey to the Double J Ranch. The road wound through rolling grasslands dotted with wildflowers before ascending into pine-covered foothills. As they crested a rise, Lillian caught her first glimpse of the ranch, a sprawling log house with a wide porch, several outbuildings, corrals, and beyond them, pastures where cattle grazed. In the distance, mountains rose against a startlingly blue sky. "It's beautiful," she said involuntarily. Preston, who had been mostly silent during the journey, smiled slightly. "My father chose this land because of that view," said a man who could look at those mountains every morning, couldn't help but think bigger thoughts. The ranch house proved to be even more impressive inside. Built of massive pine logs, it featured a great room with a stone fireplace large enough to stand in, a dining room that could seat 12, a well-appointed kitchen, and several bedrooms. Mrs. Abernathy's quarters were indeed separate, a cozy cabin just 20 yards from the main house. "This will be more than adequate," Lillian said, surveying the cabin with its cheerful curtains and braided rugs. "I wasn't expecting such comfortable accommodations." "Mrs. Abernathy insisted on making it homey," Preston explained. "Said she wouldn't stay in a barren box just because she was a housekeeper." "A wise woman," Lillian replied with her first genuine smile in months. That evening, after settling in, Lillian prepared a simple meal for Preston and his 3 ranch hands, Frank, the grizzled foreman who had to be in his 60s, young Miguel, who barely spoke English but had a dazzling smile, and Elijah, a former slave from Georgia who'd come west after the war and was, according to Frank, the best damn horseman in 4 territories. The men were polite but reserved, clearly taking their cue from Preston. They thanked her for the meal, complimented her cooking, and retired to the bunkhouse early, leaving her alone with her employer. "They're good men," Preston said as they washed dishes together, him drying while she washed, an arrangement he'd insisted on despite her protests that kitchen work was her job. "Frank's been with my family since I was a boy. The others came after I took over the ranch. After your father passed." Lillian asked. "Yes, 8 years ago. My brother Benjamin and I ran it together until last year." His hands stilled on the plate he was drying. "Ben was killed during a cattle drive, stampede. I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate as all condolences had been offered to her. Preston nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy without dwelling on it. "Widow Morrison mentioned you lost your husband and child recently. In January, influenza." Lillian kept her eyes on the soapy water. It took them both within a week of each other. They worked in silence for a moment, the shared understanding of grief creating a strange intimacy between them. "It doesn't get easier," Preston said finally, "but it gets different, less sharp around the edges eventually." Lillian glanced at him, surprised by the insight. "Yes. That's a good way to describe it." They finished the dishes in companionable silence. Before retiring to her cabin, Lillian found herself saying, "Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. James. I think being here might help." He looked at her for a long moment, his blue eyes serious. "That's what I hoped, Mrs. Keller. For both of us." The days at Double J Ranch fell into a pleasant rhythm. Lillian rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for Preston and the hands, who ate heartily before heading out to their day's work. She then cleaned, baked, mended, and prepared the midday and evening meals. It was more physical work than teaching, but she found herself sleeping better than she had since the funerals. Preston was usually gone from sunrise to sunset, returning dusty and tired, but always taking time to ask about her day. Sometimes he would linger after the other men had gone to the bunkhouse, sitting on the porch with coffee while Lillian worked on mending or lesson plans for the fall term. Their conversations started as polite exchanges, but gradually deepened. Preston told her about growing up on the ranch, about his hopes to expand the herd, about his brother who had always been the dreamer while Preston was the practical one. Lillian found herself sharing stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, her brief teaching career, and eventually, tentatively, memories of Thomas. "He was kind," she said one evening as they watched a spectacular sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Not passionate or adventurous, but steady. He provided well-wanted children," her voice caught. "James was just 6 months old when the fever came." Preston didn't offer platitudes or touch her hand in sympathy. Instead, he simply said, "Ben was the opposite. Restless, always chasing the next big idea. He wanted to drive our cattle all the way to San Francisco once, convinced we'd make a fortune. I was the one who insisted we stick to the established trails to Cheyenne." Lillian appreciated his understanding that sharing his loss was more comforting than any words of sympathy could be. As June turned to July, the days grew hotter. Lillian adapted her routine, doing most of the baking and heavy cleaning in the early morning hours when the house was coolest. One particularly scorching afternoon, she was hanging laundry when Preston returned unexpectedly. "Everything all right?" she asked, noticing he was alone. "Fine. Just came back for more water. The men are clearing a blocked stream about 2 miles out." He dismounted, leading his horse to the water trough. As the animal drank, Preston removed his hat and dunked his entire head in the trough. Lillian couldn't help but laugh at the sight of him straightening up, water streaming from his hair and beard. He grinned, looking younger and more carefree than she'd seen him. "Feels like heaven in this heat." He shook his head, sending droplets flying. "Mr. James," Lillian protested, raising a hand to shield herself from the spray. "Preston," he said suddenly. "After 2 months of feeding me, I think you can call me Preston." Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. His expression was open, almost vulnerable. "Very well, Preston, and you should call me Lillian." His smile brightened. "Lillian." He said it as if testing how it felt in his mouth. "It suits you." She felt her cheeks warm, and it had nothing to do with the summer heat. "Thank you." After refilling his canteens, Preston hesitated before mounting his horse. "There's a social in town next Saturday. Dance, picnic, that sort of thing. Marks the founding of Marysville. Would you? That is, if you'd like to attend, I'd be happy to escort you." Lillian's first instinct was to decline. She was still in mourning, technically. But Thomas had been gone for 6 months now, and while she still missed him, the raw wound of grief had begun to heal into something more bearable. "I'd like that," she said before she could overthink it. Preston's expression was like sunrise. "Good, that's good." He mounted his horse with fluid grace. "I should get back to the men. See you at supper." As he rode away, Lillian realized she was smiling, truly smiling for the first time in months. The day of the social dawned clear and hot. Lillian spent the morning preparing food to contribute to the communal tables: fried chicken, biscuits, and a peach cobbler made with fruit from the ranch's small orchard. By early afternoon, she was bathed and dressed in her best gown, a deep blue that she'd removed the mourning ribbons from the night before. When Preston knocked on her cabin door, she almost didn't recognize him. Gone were the dusty work clothes and weathered hat. Instead, he wore a crisp white shirt, black vest and trousers, and polished boots. He'd trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair. "You look lovely," he said, eyes widening as he took in her appearance. "As do you," she replied, feeling suddenly shy. "Very handsome." The drive to town was filled with a new tension, not unpleasant, but electric with possibility. Lillian found herself acutely aware of Preston beside her on the wagon seat, of the occasional brush of his arm against hers as he guided the horses. The town square had been transformed with bunting, tables laden with food, and a wooden platform where 4 musicians were tuning instruments. Lanterns hung from ropes strung between buildings, ready to illuminate the festivities once darkness fell. Lillian was greeted warmly by her students and their parents. She noticed approving glances when people saw her with Preston, and a few knowing looks exchanged among the older women. Widow Morrison actually winked at her. As the afternoon progressed into evening, Lillian found herself enjoying the celebration more than she'd expected. The food was delicious, the company pleasant, and when the dancing began, she surprised herself by accepting Preston's outstretched hand. "I'm out of practice," she warned as he led her to the area cleared for dancing. "That makes 2 of us," he replied, placing one hand respectfully at her waist while taking her hand with the other. They moved awkwardly at first, finding their rhythm. Preston was more graceful than his ranch work would suggest, and soon they were circling the dance floor with growing confidence. When the music shifted to a slower tune, he drew her slightly closer. "I'm glad you came with me today," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "So am I." The admission came easily. Lillian. The way he said her name made her heart beat faster. "These past 2 months, having you at the ranch has made it feel like home again." She looked up at him, surprised by the raw honesty in his expression. "I know it's too soon," he continued. "I know you're still grieving, but I wanted you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I would very much like to court you properly." Lillian felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the unexpected tenderness of his declaration. "I don't know if I'll ever be fully ready," she admitted. "Thomas was my husband, James was my son. I'll carry them with me always." "As you should," Preston said firmly. "I would never ask you to forget them." The music ended, but they remained standing close, oblivious to the dancers around them. "I think," Lillian said carefully, "that I might be ready to start finding out what it means to be happy again. With you, if you're patient." Preston's smile was slow and deep. "I have a whole ranch that teaches patience every day, Lillian Keller. I can certainly extend some to matters of the heart." The remainder of the evening passed in a pleasant blur. They danced again, ate slices of pie under the stars, and laughed at the antics of the children running with sparklers as the night grew late. When they finally headed back to the ranch, Lillian felt lighter than she had in months. At her cabin door, Preston took her hand and pressed it gently to his lips. "Thank you for a wonderful evening." "Thank you for asking me," she replied, reluctant to end the night. He hesitated, then said, "May I call on you tomorrow? Perhaps we could ride out to the north pasture. There's a view there I'd like to show you." "I'd like that very much." The summer days grew longer, and with them, Lillian's feelings for Preston deepened. Their Sunday rides became a cherished ritual. He showed her hidden corners of the ranch, a waterfall tucked away in a pine grove, a meadow where wildflowers grew in riotous profusion, the hilltop where his parents were buried alongside his brother. At that last spot, they shared their grief more openly than before. Preston spoke of his guilt at not being with Benjamin during the stampede, of the crushing responsibility of running the ranch alone afterward. Lillian confessed her anger at God for taking her family, her fear that she might never be a mother again. "You would be a wonderful mother," Preston said, his voice thick with emotion. "Any child would be blessed to have you." In August, as the days began to shorten, Lillian realized she was dreading her return to the schoolhouse. The thought of leaving the ranch, leaving Preston, filled her with a hollow ache. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching a thunderstorm roll across the distant plains, Preston took her hand. "School starts again in 2 weeks," he said quietly. "Yes," Lillian sighed. "I should begin packing soon." Preston's fingers tightened around hers. "What if you didn't?" She looked at him questioningly. "What if you stayed here? Not as a housekeeper, but as—" He took a deep breath. "Lillian, I love you. I think I've loved you since I saw you standing alone outside the church that first Sunday, looking so brave despite your grief." Lillian felt her heart hammering in her chest. "Preston, let me finish, please." His blue eyes were intense. "I know it's fast. I know you might not be ready. But I want you to know that this ranch, my home, could be your home too, permanently. As my wife, if you'll have me." Tears filled Lillian's eyes, not from sorrow or hesitation, but from the overwhelming realization that she loved this man, his strength, his gentleness, his understanding of her pain because he had walked a similar path. "I was so lost when I came to Marysville," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought my life was over. I never imagined I could feel this way again, hopeful, alive." She squeezed his hand. "Yes, Preston, I will stay. I will be your wife." His kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with the promise of their future together. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Preston pressed his forehead to hers. "Start over here with me," he whispered. "We'll build something beautiful from our broken pieces." They were married 2 weeks later in the small Marysville church where they had first seen each other. Widow Morrison wept openly. Frank stood as Preston's best man, beaming with pride. Lillian wore a cream-colored dress with lace at the collar, not white, in deference to her previous marriage, but not black either. It was a new beginning. Preston had secretly prepared a surprise for his bride. During the weeks of their courtship, he had converted a small bedroom adjacent to the master bedroom into a nursery, painted with scenes of the mountains and meadows surrounding the ranch. "For when you're ready," he told her as he showed her the room on their first night as husband and wife. "No pressure, no expectations. Just a promise that I'm open to whatever our future holds." Lillian, overcome, could only hold him tightly, marveling at how this man seemed to understand exactly what her heart needed. Their first year of marriage brought challenges along with joy. A harsh winter tested the ranch's resources. Cattle prices dropped temporarily, causing financial strain. Lillian took up teaching again, riding to the schoolhouse 3 days a week while Preston's new housekeeper, a cheerful widow named Mrs. Henderson, managed the ranch house. Through it all, their bond strengthened. They learned each other's habits and preferences, found rhythm in their shared life, and supported each other through moments of grief that still occasionally surfaced. On the anniversary of little James's death, Preston held Lillian as she wept, then rode with her to a hilltop where they released flower petals into the wind in remembrance. Spring brought renewal in more ways than one. As wildflowers began to dot the pastures again, Lillian discovered she was with child. Preston's joy was tempered with concern for her fears. "Are you afraid?" he asked one night, his hand gently resting on her still flat stomach. "Terrified," she admitted, "but also hopeful. This child won't replace James, but it deserves all the love I can give." "We'll face it together," Preston promised. "Whatever comes." What came was a healthy baby boy, born on a crisp October morning just as the aspens turned golden on the mountainsides. They named him William Thomas James, honoring both their pasts while looking toward their future. 2 years later, a daughter joined their family, Rebecca Lillian, a spirited child with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined nature. The nursery that Preston had prepared with such hope became a place of laughter and bedtime stories. 5 years after Lillian had first arrived in Marysville with nothing but grief and 2 trunks of possessions, the Double J Ranch hosted a celebration. Friends from town and neighboring ranches gathered to commemorate the expansion of the ranch house and the completion of a small schoolhouse built on the property. Lillian would teach there, serving not only her own children but those of the ranch hands and nearby homesteaders. As twilight fell and lanterns were lit around the yard, Preston found Lillian standing on the porch, watching their children playing tag with the other youngsters. "Happy?" he asked, slipping his arm around her waist. "Completely." She leaned into him. "I never imagined that day I stepped off the stagecoach that I would find this kind of happiness again." "I knew the moment I saw you," Preston said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I just had to convince you to start over here." Lillian turned in his arms. "Best decision I ever made." As they sealed the moment with a kiss, William ran up to tug at his father's trousers. "Papa, Miss Morrison says there's going to be dancing. Will you and Mama show us how?" Preston laughed, swinging his son up into his arms. "What do you say, Mrs. James? Shall we show these youngsters how it's done?" "Lead the way, Mr. James," Lillian replied with a smile that outshone the lanterns. "As always." Under the stars, with their children watching and their friends clapping in rhythm, they danced not as 2 people bound by shared grief, but as partners who had built joy from sorrow, strength from weakness, and love from the ashes of loss. The ranch that had once felt too empty to Preston now overflowed with life. The woman who had arrived with nothing but grief had found not just a home, but a future. Together, they had created something neither could have imagined alone, a family forged in understanding, tempered by hardship, and sustained by a love that honored the past while embracing all the promises of tomorrow. As the years passed, the Double J Ranch flourished under their care. Preston expanded the cattle operation, while Lillian's small schoolhouse grew to accommodate 20 students from surrounding properties. William, their firstborn, showed his father's aptitude for ranching from an early age, while Rebecca developed her mother's love of books and teaching. In 1885, they welcomed another son, Christopher Frank, named partly for the aging foreman who had been like family to Preston. Frank, now too old for the physically demanding work of running cattle, became the children's honorary grandfather, teaching them to whittle fish and tell tall tales that made Lillian roll her eyes even as she smiled. Life was not without its hardships. A severe drought in 1886 threatened the ranch's survival, forcing Preston to sell off half the herd at reduced prices to ensure the remaining cattle had enough feed to survive. That winter brought blizzards that trapped them in the house for days at a time, testing everyone's patience and resources. Yet through each challenge, Preston and Lillian faced the difficulties as they had promised together. Their partnership had evolved into something rare and precious, a balance of strengths that allowed them to weather whatever came their way. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Preston surprised Lillian with a gift he'd been planning for months: a small library built onto the ranch house, with floor-to-ceiling shelves and a window seat overlooking her favorite view of the mountains. "For all the books you've been cramming into every available space," he teased as she explored the room in wonder. "And for the writer I know you have inside you." Lillian had indeed begun writing down her experiences, initially as a way to process her journey from grief to joy, but increasingly with an eye toward possibly sharing her story with others who had experienced loss. "It's perfect," she whispered, running her fingers along the empty shelves that waited to be filled. "How did you know exactly what I needed?" Preston's smile was tender. 10 years of paying attention, my love. As their children grew, so did the community around them. Marysville expanded as the railroad finally reached the town in 1889, bringing new settlers and opportunities. Preston served on the town council, while Lillian organized the first County Teachers Association. William, at 16, began taking on more responsibility at the ranch, showing a natural talent for breeding stock that even surpassed his father's. Rebecca, 14 and precociously intelligent, set her sights on attending college in Denver, a plan her parents supported wholeheartedly, though Preston privately admitted to Lillian that the thought of their daughter so far from home terrified him more than any stampeding cattle ever had. Young Christopher, at 11, was still finding his path, equally at home helping with ranch chores or losing himself in the books that filled his mother's library. He had inherited Lillian's thoughtful nature along with Preston's steady determination. In 1893, 15 years after Lillian had first arrived in Marysville, tragedy threatened their hard-won happiness. Preston, while helping neighboring ranchers fight a wildfire that swept through the drought-parched hills north of town, was severely injured when a burning tree fell, trapping him beneath it. For 3 days, he hovered between life and death, his body burned and broken. Lillian refused to leave his bedside, sending William to manage the ranch with Frank's guidance while Rebecca took over caring for Christopher and the household. On the 4th night, as Lillian dozed in a chair beside Preston's bed, her hand clutching his, she felt his fingers tighten around hers. "Lillian," he whispered, his voice raspy from smoke inhalation. She was instantly awake. "I'm here. I'm right here, my love." His blue eyes, clouded with pain but clear with purpose, found hers. "If I don't you dare," she interrupted fiercely. "Don't you dare say goodbye to me, Preston James. Not after everything we've built together." A ghost of his familiar smile touched his cracked lips. "Stubborn woman. You knew that when you married me," she replied, tears streaming down her face despite her attempt at humor. "Remember what you told me once. We'll face whatever comes together." He nodded weakly. Together. Preston's recovery was slow and grueling. Burns covered his left side from shoulder to hip, and 2 broken ribs had punctured his lung. For weeks, he could barely move without excruciating pain. Yet bit by bit, with Lillian's unwavering support and his own stubborn determination, He began to heal. By spring, he was walking again, though with a noticeable limp. By summer, he could ride short distances, allowing him to survey parts of the ranch from horseback. His left arm never regained its full strength, but he adapted, finding new ways to accomplish necessary tasks. "I'm half the man I was," he said bitterly one evening, struggling with buttons that his scarred fingers couldn't manage. Lillian moved to help him, her touch gentle but her gaze stern. "Preston James, you listen to me. You are twice the man most will ever be, scars and all." To prove her point, she kissed each of the burned scars on his shoulder and arm, then his lips, with a passion that left no doubt about her feelings. That night, for the first time since his injury, they made love carefully, tenderly, reaffirming the connection that had sustained them through 15 years of joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge. As Preston finally drifted to sleep in her arms, Lillian reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From two people shattered by loss to the strong family they'd built together, it had been a path neither could have walked alone. The following year brought changes that tested them in different ways. William, now 19, announced his intention to study veterinary medicine in Colorado Springs. Rebecca, accepted to a women's college in Denver with a scholarship, prepared to leave as well. Only Christopher would remain at home, and he was growing more independent daily. "The house will seem so empty," Lillian said as they prepared for the double departure. "I never thought I'd miss the noise and chaos, but I already do." Preston, now fully recovered except for his limp and the scars he would carry forever, put his arm around her shoulders. "We could always fill it up again." She looked at him questioningly. "Not with more children," he clarified with a chuckle, "though I wouldn't object if that's what you wanted." "But I was thinking of those letters you received last month." The letters had come from a children's aid society in Chicago, responding to inquiries Lillian had made about orphans needing homes in the West. With so many children left parentless by disease, accidents, and poverty in the crowded eastern cities, the society was eager to find placements in healthier environments with families who could provide stability. "You're serious?" Lillian asked. "About taking in orphans?" Preston nodded. "This ranch has always had room for more love, and who better to help children who have lost everything than two people who know exactly how that feels." The decision was made. After William and Rebecca departed for their studies, amid many tears, but also tremendous pride, Preston and Lillian welcomed the first of what would eventually be 12 orphan children to the Double J Ranch over the next decade. Some stayed briefly, eventually reuniting with extended family or moving on to other opportunities. Others became permanent additions to their family, legally adopted and given the James name. By 1905, almost 3 decades after Lillian had first arrived in Montana Territory, now the state of Montana, the Double J Ranch had become known throughout the region not just for its fine cattle and horses, but for its open-hearted approach to family. William had returned after completing his studies, setting up a veterinary practice that served Marysville and the surrounding ranches. He married the daughter of a neighboring rancher, and they built a home on the eastern edge of the Double J property. Rebecca completed her education and surprised everyone by returning to Montana rather than pursuing opportunities in the East. "This is home," she explained simply. She established a proper school in Marysville that went through 10th grade, allowing local children much more education than had previously been available without leaving the area. Christopher, who had discovered a talent for architecture during the expansion of the ranch, designed several buildings in the growing town, including a new church and meeting hall. His quiet confidence and innovative ideas earned him commissions from as far away as Helena. On the 40th anniversary of Lillian's arrival in Marysville, the entire extended family, biological children, adopted children, grandchildren, and those who had become family through bonds of friendship, gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Lillian, now 66 but still straight-backed and clear-eyed, stood with Preston on the porch of the house that had become the heart of so many lives. At 70, his hair was completely silver, and he relied more heavily on a cane, but his blue eyes were as piercing and kind as ever. "Did you ever imagine this?" he asked, gesturing to the dozens of people spread across the yard, talking, laughing, sharing stories. "That day when you offered a grieving widow a place to start over," Preston smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "I hoped," he said simply. "But you exceeded every hope, Lillian James." She leaned against him, her head fitting perfectly beneath his chin just as it had for 40 years. "We did this together." As twilight settled over the mountains and the stars began to emerge, William called for everyone's attention. Standing with his wife and their 3 children, he raised a glass. "To Mom and Dad," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet gathering. "Who taught us all that the greatest act of courage is to love again after loss, and the greatest legacy is the family we choose." "To Preston and Lillian," echoed dozens of voices. Looking out at the faces illuminated by lantern-light faces that represented lives touched, shaped, and in many cases saved by the home they had created together, Lillian felt a sense of completion that transcended anything she could have imagined that cold day in 1878, when she had stepped off the stagecoach with nothing but grief and the clothes on her back. Preston's arm tightened around her waist. "No regrets," he whispered. She turned to look into the face she had loved for so long, weathered by time and hardship, but still the most beautiful sight in her world. "Not a single one," she replied, and sealed the truth of it with a kiss. In the soft Montana twilight, surrounded by the family they had built from the broken pieces of their earlier lives, Preston and Lillian James stood as living testimony to the power of second chances, the healing gift of new beginnings, and the enduring strength of a love that had started with simple words offered to a grieving stranger. "Start over here."